All right, hi everyone. I'm Alan Sun, and I have a special guest here coming all the way from Korea on Zoom. I'm here with Kim. Kim, why don't you just introduce yourself first? Who are you?
Uh, I'm Kim. That is it. Just a
There's
human being.
more.
But my name is Kimberly Giangtran. I am a fourth year at UC San Diego. I recently finished my term as AS president, which is student body president at UC San Diego. So I served from 2020 to 2021 during quite a wild year where my entire term was remote. So I never have stepped foot in my office and everything was done from home. So it's been quite a very challenging yet rewarding experience. And I think I've learned so much. And I want to share some of that with Alan today and you all.
I'm so grateful for Kim. Not only is her endurance so high and her tenacity, but going through a pandemic and serving in that way is just really a reflection of who she is. So I'm so glad to have her as a Gen Zer. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about politics and Gen Z. In a report by the General Social Survey, it was reported that there's an increase of growth in 18 to 29-year-olds identifying as independent for their political party. And my question for you too is just at this, have you experienced this among your generation? And why do you think that is?
I actually have experienced that quite a lot with my friends that I've talked about. And I have actually met a few people here who have said I've registered as a third party or independent. And I think that's a pretty common thing nowadays, especially for Gen Z. There's no perfect candidate, like ever, hold all of the same views and the ideals that you have. And you want someone who looks like you, who has similar identities as you. But I think that's just simply not possible to have one person who can represent everyone and all your identities. And I think that's a frustrating thing for people to see because like you want to see yourself represented. You want to have someone who understands your experiences, your stories and things like that. But registering as an independent is a very Gen Z thing to do. And I think it's a very strong and powerful thing to do. And it makes a statement, right? It says, the two main parties in the states are the Democrats and the Republicans. It's simply saying that you all aren't representing me well. And if you aren't going to do it, then I'm not going to support you. And I think it's a very strong statement that people are making by saying, hey, like you're not doing a good job. And whoever you're putting up as your candidate for president isn't enough for me. So I'm going to go off and vote for someone else.
Yeah. You mentioned this earlier that you ran and became AS president at UCSD last year. And I was just curious, like, what are major conversations that your generation was caring about that you found while you were campaigning and everything?
The peak of elections and when I termed in as president, the conversations around the George Floyd murder. And that was such a wake-up call for me, for everyone, literally the entire world, right? And the major conversations revolved around racial equity and how this has been going on for years and years, and our nation was built on this foundation of racism, and it had just come to light. Racial equity was a topic that we talked about my entire term and how we could do better and how UC San Diego and AS could better support our communities of color. It's no surprise that during the pandemic and during my term, we talked a lot about healthcare, mental health, and economic security. I think the pandemic really just shook us all up, and it made everything come to perspective for us. And I think one of the things that really stood out for all of us was how impermanent things were. So everything we knew as normal and stable, like it was gone, like immediately. The fact that we didn't need to go to work anymore in person, that we didn't need to go to school in person anymore, that just shook us to our core. And people were now talking about how if all these things were possible before the pandemic, then what was life before this? Like healthcare was one of the things that we talked about a lot, was who had access to healthcare, how certain communities are disproportionately disadvantaged. And just here in Korea, and it seems like every other nation in the world except the United States has universal healthcare.
Yep,
yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, so that is the conversation we had all the time. And it breaks my heart to think about the people who are hesitant to even go to the emergency room or seek medical care because they're worried about the bills, right? That is not a thing here at all. Like if you have a problem, you go to the emergency room, you go to the doctor, and you don't worry about money at all. And the last one that I would probably what I'm very most passionate about is mental health, right? We were locked up for almost a year and a half. It was probably, I don't
18
even
months,
know.
yeah.
18 months. It was hard for everyone, and not just Gen Z, but we all felt just the weight of the pandemic and just feeling so isolated and helpless and just not really being able to do anything but wait for the pandemic to pass over. And even when we thought it was over, it was months after months after months. Now we have just accepted that we're going to live with it. So
obviously we all didn't have a choice to walk through a pandemic, but your leadership in that season was really highlighted by service and to the students and to those around you. So I really appreciated just, I mean, you were posting different things and you were struggling too on Zoom University and trying to get through. And so I really appreciate what you had to say about, I think that impermanence, that reality of we're here, it's what we're trying to be present, have hope. And I think that's a really important thing to instill in others. So I appreciate that. We saw these big issues just come to the surface, even when we're locked up, we're talking about these values. And the Pew Research around 2016, they said 58% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats viewed the other party with hatred, quote unquote hatred. And as compared to 94, when it was 21% of Republicans and 17% of Democrats that they considered the other party actually very unfavorable. How does Gen Z and how do you interact with that national divide that we're actually living in today?
It's really unfortunate, I think. And it's unfortunate that we other immediately. It's such a dangerous thing nowadays that we kind of other immediately and we're not willing to engage in conversation anymore. And that's really disappointing for me to see because healthy debate is like so important, right? That's how you gain perspective. That's how you convince each other differently. And that's how you learn from others and try to understand where they're coming from. But I think confirmation bias is something that is very, very pertinent in our lives, right? We share values with someone who is of our party, and we immediately are like, oh, yes, immediately. And we hear that someone is of the opposite party, and it's like, oh, like I could never, how could you? So it's become very personal. And I think the way I deal with that is, I think at the end of the day, we just all need to have some empathy for one another, right? We're all human beings. And I think we tend to forget that so much. I think with the rise and just the popularity of social media, it makes it so much easier for us to see others as just not human beings, right? You have this little phone screen and you can type all the things you want, and you never have to face this person and look them in the eye and actually say all those things you would say online to them in person. And if you can just see like the impacts that your words and your actions have on someone, I think it would make you think twice before you say something, or just be more willing to have a conversation with them and just have a little more empathy for one another.
Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, and that's the, especially coming out of the pandemic, that's the route I think that few travel but many need, empathy. So I agree. Thank you. Lastly, just from your experience and your thoughts, what do you think are major issues for America coming up for Gen Z in politics when we hold the two together? Like, do you think your generation cares right now?
I think we care deeply, but I think we're just trying to figure out how to channel all that care and that energy that we have and make it useful and effective, right? And I think that was something that was realized in the pandemic, is that people were sitting at home on their phones and they saw all these things happening. They saw all these protests in the streets, and they saw people just speaking out about things, but they felt like there was nothing they could do. And there are plenty of things you can do, but I think the frustrating part is that when you put so much effort and energy into something and you don't see something tangible come out of it, that's where you get really discouraged and disappointed. And that's like any kind of government, right? There's a lot of conversation, there's all these talks, and it takes time for things to happen. And sometimes you don't see the fruits of your labor immediately, and you don't have something tangible to say, I went out to protest and I did all these things, and look at it now. And you can't do that with social issues, right? You can't really like display it, put it on display. And I think that our generation cares deeply, and we're just figuring out how to make our care and our anger and our frustration and all the energy we have become something that is effective. Because if you don't channel it well, we're afraid it's going to go, it's just going to fall short of something. But I think the major issues for America that Gen Z is talking about is obviously surrounding topics that have been hot topics for a while. So like climate change is very real. And that's been a conversation I've had more and more with my friends about whether they want to have kids and have kids live in the world that is going to be given to them. And climate change, social inequity, and mental health are three of the things that I've heard quite a lot in the past few years.
That's so important, because your generation is the one that's going to steward what's next. And I think that older generations like mine need to listen, I think, with a non-judgmental viewpoint for you all, because you carry what the future is. And I think there's an exciting part of that, but then there's also a fearful moment of letting things go for older generations, but also to trust that, wow, this generation cares and speaks more about mental health, about values, about inclusivity. I think that's something we've realized. Like Gen Z really cares about how our language affects people on the outside and minorities. And I think that's a beautiful thing that we're all trying to pick up. So I really appreciate that.
We're handed down all these issues, and now, I think, I forgot which organization said that we have not a lot of time to clean up the mess of climate change, and that we only have a few more years to do something before it's like irreversible. So it's kind of like a dooming fate for us, where it's like you were handed down these things, and now it's our responsibility to fix it. But it kind of feels like it is true at the moment for us.
Sure. And to move from the doom and gloom, I think that value that we were talking about with the empathy, I think that crosses generations. And I think that's the hope, that we see that and we feel that, and we'll know how to best steward your voices and hopefully make a better world where many can fit in it. So yeah. Well, thank you, Kim. So good to talk with you. And I really appreciate your thoughts and everything. So
yeah, thanks for having me, Alan. I had a great time.